All right, I'm going to go and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Priya Chaya. I am the Associate Director of Content here at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're really excited to have you all here today for the first webinar in a series marking the National Trust's 75th anniversary. Today's webinar, as you can see on the screen, is called Creating Community with Cheap Old Houses. And this is a conversation between National Trust President and CEO Carol Quillen, Elizabeth Finkelstein, and Cristiana Peña. And we're looking forward to this really exciting conversation. But before we get started, I have, as always, a few logistics to share with you today. We are going to take questions from the audience at the end of the webinar. However, you can send in your questions at any point in the webinar via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to submit them at any point, but we will be waiting until the end to answer them. You are also encouraged, as you are already doing, to communicate with each other through the chat function. The closed captioning function is also enabled for this webinar. You can turn it off and turn it off, turn it on and turn it off, either through the controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen or through your audio settings. It really depends on what version of Zoom you're using. Following the program, we will send out a recording of today's session directly to the email you used to register. And finally, all National Trust webinars are available on our YouTube channel. As a reminder, we ask that everyone is respectful to each other in the chat and follow our code of conduct, which my colleague Colleen will be sharing in the chat shortly, if she has not already. And finally, I also wanted to thank you. So much of our work is possible because of your interest and support. And that's why we're so grateful you've joined us today for what promises to be an exciting conversation. And for those of you who are here for the first time learning about the National Trust, we are really also excited to have you there. So welcome to the session. So let's, before we get started, let's do a quick introduction of our speakers today. Today we'll hear from Elizabeth Finkelstein, who's the creator and host of Who's Afraid of Cheap Old Houses? Who's Afraid of a Cheap Old House? Cristiana Peña, who's a preservationist and social media strategist of Circa Old Houses, whom the National Trust has partnered with since 2020 to connect property sellers and interested buyers. And they will both be in conversation with the National Trust for Historic Preservation's 10th president and CEO, Carol Quillen, who just marked her one-year anniversary with the organization. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth, Cristiana, and Carol as they talk about the joys and challenges around living in and owning a historic home, and how these sites create stronger connections to neighborhoods and communities and bring a sense of wonder and fun to the preservation process. Elizabeth, Cristiana, and Carol, if you can come on screen. Then I'm going to pop off. Carol, on to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Elizabeth and Cristiana, for joining us. We're really excited to have you both here. It's been so fun to learn more about your work in getting ready for this webinar, and I know our listeners are really excited to hear from you. So let's get started. Why don't we just take a few minutes to have each of you introduce yourself and maybe say a little bit about how you came to this work. So Elizabeth, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Elizabeth Finkelstein. I am, I guess, most recently the founder of Cheap Old Houses. I came to this work as a child born in an old house, in a cheap old house that my parents restored. Went on to get my master's degree in historic preservation, and then started Circa Old Houses, which we partnered with Cristiana on way back when, which spun into a little viral Instagram feed called Cheap Old Houses that took on a life of its own, and then eventually became an HGTV show. Series 1 was Cheap Old Houses. Series 2 was Who's Afraid of a Cheap Old House, and a book, Cheap Old Houses, An Unconventional Guide to Loving and Restoring a Forgotten Home, right back there. And now we are just, we have subscription newsletters for people interested in purchasing cheap old houses of all types. And honestly, one of the favorite things we've done has been a continued partner of the National Trust, just in so much support of everything you do. Coming from sort of a policy preservation background, I understand how critical it is, all the work that you're doing. So very excited to be here.
Well, we are incredibly grateful to to have you here and to have your support for our work. So thank you so much. And we'll come back to learn a little bit more about some of the places that you've worked on and that have inspired you to continue to do this work. Cristiana, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came to this work and maybe share a little bit about a project that matters a lot to you or that you've both worked on?
Sure. Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone. I'm Cristiana Peña. As Carol and Elizabeth said, I am the director of social media for Circle Old Houses. But really, it's funny. I feel like I'm kind of at the polar opposite end of your kind of upbringing, Elizabeth, like, really born into an old house. I was through my entire life in middle America. I was raised in South Dakota in a house that was built, in like 1996 or something like that. Nothing necessarily architecturally exciting. And I think maybe for a lot of people who have that similar stories, probably what made me excited about when I could experience historic architecture and get into a space that had a story, because that wasn't necessarily something that I was always surrounded with, and really just followed that trajectory through school. I also have a master's in historic preservation from Columbia, worked in nonprofit advocacy in the city for 5 or 6 years, also worked in cultural site management in the Bronx at the historic Woodlawn Cemetery and a lot of other places. And that was really what got me excited about and interested in working in the communication side of historic preservation, because so much of what we do, we've all drank the Kool-Aid. We all get why preservation and history and historic sites matter, but getting that messaging out to other people can be really challenging. And so just over the years, I've been working more and more in that space and find it really exciting to bring other people kind of into the fold with us. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. And Carol, you said, what's something that maybe Elizabeth and I have collaborated on recently? We work together every day in the context of Circa Old Houses, which is a real estate marketplace for historic homes with character across the country. And more recently with Cheap Old Houses, as I and my partner bought our first house, which is a cheap old house, we were really fortunate to get to work with Elizabeth and her husband, Ethan, as part of the production for their second series for HGTV, Who's Afraid of a Cheap Old House? So I thought I would share just a little snippet of that so people can get a sense of the context of where I'm zooming in from today, but also see some of the great work that Elizabeth and Cheap Old Houses have allowed people just like me to get to share. So can I go and do that?
That'd be great. That'd be great. So Christiana's going to show a short video, and I'm just going to let you take that away.
Excellent. If people see a slight delay between mouths moving and sound, it might just be a result of streaming. Apologies, but you can go watch this episode 3 on Max at any time at your convenience. All right.
I mean, it's amazing and old. Where's the kitchen? Where's all the things that a house has?
We could add that. We can make it happen, right?
I know this sounds ridiculous, but there are so many old churches that have been turned into amazing homes. In a house that's already laid out, you're constrained by what's there, so you don't necessarily have as much creativity. Here, you can have all the original details, but also make it whatever you want, and there's so much freedom in that.
It's hard to see.
It's such like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
I'm more stuck on the timeline aspect.
We're gonna bring in a historic preservationist. That's my wife. Interior designer and an amazing contracting team to take care of anything that comes at us. Once we start peeling back this crazy old house that will be like an onion, you will cry, but it won't take that much time. Hey, you guys.
Oh my God.
It looks like a building
so
that's painted.
New. Oh,
Look at this.
my gosh.
Look at the
that.
sign.
Look at that sign.
Wow.
The sign is trash.
Hey, Dad.
Welcome home. Oh.
Got out of the car. I don't know. My mind kind of went blank.
It went from bright white to mimicking natural brownstone, which was all the rage when this church would have been renovated in the 1870s.
You can really appreciate the lines of the church now in a way that's almost like sharp and minimal. And then we went with a lighter gray to sort of contrast all those amazing, beautiful details against that sort of warm brown.
I was just thinking I've never seen gray pop so hard.
Right?
It's
Not
such a
even with the
transformation.
same. Yeah.
The paint looks incredible.
Now it feels like the church is living up to what the sign represents. Like the sign says it's the first church in the town of Granville, and that's significant. I can't believe this is ours. This is just like surreal.
You guys live here for $99,000. $1,000.
This is
I feel like you
nuts.
just scored a cheap old mansion.
The light, like, it's like emanating warmth, you know? Like, I can see the light inside, like, already coming through.
Wait until you get inside because
my
it is warmth and glowy. All right,
I don't know if I'm prepared for this.
after you.
All right.
Holy shit.
Oh my God!
Elizabeth, you did it. And here we are today.
That's amazing. It's amazing to see that and to see the kind of transformation, but also, you know, a little bit of the anxiety and trepidation in your voice when you were starting. One of the things, Elizabeth, that you said in that video is that there's something about an old house or an old space that inspires creativity. Can you say more about that? I think that's a really interesting point about the different ways in which an old space might constrain you from sort of a laid out house. I'd love to hear you both talk a little bit about how that creative process comes into play when you're restoring or renovating a cheap old house.
Yeah, I can start. I think for me, it's all about the challenge. I think constraints are the best friend of any creativity. You know, having a blank slate is a particular type of challenge. But being able to find something and then look at it and understand that you have to fix it in order to work it into the larger picture, I think is so critical. And I found certainly in the world of old house restoration. And I think we all know we've all in our old houses hired contractors that were maybe not the right choice, but there are fixers out there and there are people who don't fix but maybe decide that they want to start new. And I think there's such fun and magic and creativity in the figuring out how to fix something, and it's just a constant learning experience that is so much fun. I mean, with that church, if you can see beyond Cristiana, that church won a preservation award decades ago for popcorning over that gorgeous muraled ceiling above her. That's a little hard to see in Zoom, but it's a really magical thing. So, you know, with that, there was the decision to reveal that, the decision to do what we did was always dictated by the house. The house would tell us what to do. This isn't about going in and imposing our own taste on something. It is the right thing to do. We will reveal it. And I think we're so happy with how it turned out. And and now that Cristiana and I work together so often, we're just in it all the time. So I feel like it's a little bit ours too. So
Exactly.
claim.
Well, I totally agree with you. I mean, before owning a cheap old house, an old house of any kind, as I said, I worked in advocacy and I was working in New York City, in Manhattan. And part of my job, part of Elizabeth's job, we were really kind of counterparts at two organizations just working in different neighborhoods. But part of both of our jobs was showing up to the Landmarks Preservation Commission regularly to review projects that people were proposing for alterations to landmark properties, individual or historic districts, whatever the case may be. And they're working within a set of rules and guidelines. And not all jurisdictions have this, but New York City does. And so they're working within rules, and it'd be so interesting to see how sometimes, you know, designers and owners would just say, you know, this is ridiculous. I should be able to do whatever I want, you know, blow through this building, whatever. And other people, just like Elizabeth was saying, really embraced it and said, the reason I'm even here is because I love this history and it's inspiring me. So these rules are not a hindrance. They're something to help me make sure that we're all preserving this thing that we've identified as something that we all love. And it makes you just try harder to think more creatively, exactly like you said, about how can I achieve my goal? How can I get over this, what might seem like a hurdle? And in the end, it almost always makes the project so much better because it really just forced you to kind of be ingenious about it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so, I mean, that really strikes a chord with me, especially since I've been at the trust, to be able to see so many adaptive reuse projects across the country where a smart developer or individual has taken a space and reimagined it in light of, for example, I mean, Cristiana, you're living in this church, right? It's a place that has been activated and filled with life now because you're there. And people who want to both connect with the past and can see the potential in these places that I do think inspires creativity, right? I do think that when you're constrained by something, I want to protect the historically distinctive features of this place, you think more creatively about how you go about that. And I wonder if there's one thing, Elizabeth, you mentioned the ceiling, if there's something else about your house, Cristiana, where you're like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do about that? That you really had to think hard about coming up with a particularly creative solution for?
Well, I think one of the things that's been especially important I think one of the things that cheap old houses really, as a company, as a mission, as an ethos, encourages people to do is to slow down. I think preservation asks people to slow down also, which can be so important. And that's exactly what we did here. You know, as soon as we bought this building, I'm in the church and there's a tiny little cottage just to the side of it where we've been living while all this has been happening, which was essential for us. But it forced us to really live in the space and understand how the space can best serve us and what we need out of it, versus I feel like so many of us expect, like, I'm ready for a house, turnkey, move in ready. It should do all the things and all this whole process. And I think there are so many success stories with cheap old houses where people, you know, moved in and they lived in one little room with a hot plate because none of the other rooms were habitable. And I'm not saying that you have to like basically camp in your own home, though some people have, but I just think that general lesson of we can take our time and learn from this house has been incredibly meaningful to us. And I hope other people feel that too. I mean, for us, for example, when we moved into this church, if you watch the full episode, there was a huge hole in the floor from a previous occupant. It's only hearsay. I don't know if this is true, but we were told that somebody at one time was going to put a puppet theater in the church, and they created this huge hole for the mechanics and things, and then decided that was not the thing, and they left, but they left the hole. And so at first I thought to myself, well, this hole's here, we should work with it, and maybe that's a circulation space to get down to the basement level. But the longer we were here, we really recognized that the basement was not going to be that kind of a space for us. And so I'm glad that we didn't day one make that decision and base every decision around that, because it would have just been such a huge mistake. Like the way that this slower pace resulted in has been exactly what we've needed it to be.
Yeah, it's so interesting. That does kind of go against the desire for immediate gratification, you know, or some image in your head of what you think you need or want. And how that image of what you think you need or want can narrow the options you're willing to consider in ways that I think, as you both are pointing out so powerfully, really do crush our creativity in some sense, so that everybody wants the same thing and everybody's house looks the same. Along those lines, you know, Elizabeth, I've heard you talk and read in your book that you talk a little bit about a kind of different version of the American dream. You say at the beginning, you know, we've been sold the wrong version of the American dream. There's another way to think about the American dream out there. There's another way to imagine homeownership. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that. That's a powerful, memorable statement. And I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about your version of the American dream.
Yeah, well, I think the American dream when it comes to homeownership has been very much about, you know, you get your starter home and then you get something bigger and then you get something bigger and then you get your TV and then you get your bigger car. And then you know, it's so much wrapped up into this idea of consumerism. And I think what's gotten lost in that is the environment. Realizing that what that requires is endless money and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which is more and more to maintain. And it isn't necessarily, I think, the best thing for society. When you think about anytime you order even a brand new piece of furniture and it comes, you know, from overseas, and the amount of styrofoam that is on like a single thing, it just perpetuates this kind of cycle. And even in home renovation, I mean, the idea of, you know, putting plastic windows in or putting low maintenance products on your house, that all is that same, I think, concern and issue. And the American dream that we talk about in our book is people investing themselves into homes and finding the path to the dream through the process. So it is the work, it is the satisfaction that comes from nurturing something. It is buying into a community, as Cristiana did. You know, they bought a church. And I think churches are such an interesting case, and maybe a great example of kind of what I'm trying to illustrate here is that everyone thinks they belong to the whole community. And I think if you have a special house and that big old house that everybody's always admired, I think the same can be said for that. But when you have a church anchoring a community, everyone thinks that you know, it's an anchor of the community and we don't want anything to happen to it. And yet congregations across America are dwindling. You know, we're becoming less and less of a religious society, and these buildings are finding themselves with very small budgets. And if they have a budget, they're trying to fulfill their mission of, food and social programming and maybe not maintaining $1 million building. And so it presents this interesting challenge. But I think when you buy into a building, whether it be a church or one of many old houses in a community that really makes up the fabric, you're it's kind of instant friends. Like people come to you, people share stories. It's kind of an interesting instant community. And I think that all of that process is the American dream that we are thinking of, about people being creative. I mean, when I think of America, I think of this as a society of pull up your bootstraps, figure it out. Maybe your house is not going to qualify for traditional financing. What are some other ways you can go about it? And we have written a book of cheap old house owners, all of whom have come at this from different backgrounds, different makeup, different ages, different financial situations, and have all figured out a way to make it work for them. And I think that that's the America in terms of housing that we kind of love and embrace and want to highlight a bit more. And also thinking of places that are off of people's normal radars in terms of real estate. And that I think the pandemic really kicked it off, but the idea of location has changed drastically now that everybody is so used to working from home. And what does that mean for our communities? And seeing people maybe invest in homes that are in places that they may not have considered before, but now they have an option to live in, is also shifting around our version of what life in this country can be. So it's an interesting time.
Yeah. And I think everything that you're saying is so fascinating to me, because I'm a little bit of an outsider to preservation. I did grow up in an old house filled with stories that to which I was attached, these individual stories, that many of which I made up, but that I invented given the particularity of the house that I grew up in. So I understand that attachment, but you're really talking about a version of the American dream. And this speaks powerfully to me as a historian, where we're talking about all the things that this version of the American dream honors, right? And I think about that with preservation. I think of all the things that preservation creates. And you're talking about the kind of creativity that gets unleashed when you think about connecting with an older house, being responsible for the environment and sustainability, and thinking about how we protect the planet. And then the really interesting thing I'm hearing from you both is building community, how these places that have anchored their community, that have been there for a while, that have histories and stories, do provide a kind of community connection. And that is that's unusual. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I would have thought about that, the ways in which, investing yourself and your time in one of these cheap old houses really does help build community, especially maybe in places where we don't normally think of preservation as being active. Preservation can be thought of as more of like an urban phenomenon, or it takes place in certain neighborhoods. But you're talking about the power of this activity all over the country.
Yeah. Sorry, I have a lot to say about this.
Well,
I'm sorry. I thought you were concluding your thought. I'm interested in you saying that you're an outsider to preservation, because I think that Cristiana and I guess we kind of grew up as insiders to preservation by getting a formal degree in this and working kind of in the formal world of preservation policy in New York City for a long time. But I feel like I got my degree in preservation when I was 2 years old, playing around in my old house. And I think it's been very important to both of us. And I think this is why Cristiana and I constantly our thoughts are kind of constantly aligned on this, is that we wanted to open up the conversation. So we don't care if you even know what preservation means, or if you know what any of the terminology means. But if you feel the magic when you walk into an old house, that's the gateway drug. Like you're good. You can come in and you can have this conversation with us. And so we've tried to be very we don't use a lot of like insider terminology or even strong architectural terms on cheap old houses in Circa, that this is a place where everybody can share in the magic of this house. Because I think that if you can make people feel a little bit like they're part of that club, and give them a place and give them a sense of purpose. I mean, all of us are here. All of us are in this community because we are finding purpose in ourselves through the restoration of homes and through the love of these homes. And I think that's what we have to make people, we have to make people feel a part of something. And so it's always been our goal in our communication to be constantly celebrating people's involvement on whatever scale it is, whether they're coming at this with millions of dollars to restore a giant mansion, which God bless those people, give me all the rich people who want to give
Not
all
me.
their money to big old
Yeah.
houses, or people who maybe all they can afford to do is buy some straight paint stripper and get their front door done this year. And that's enough for them. And they're all part of the conversation. So that's just something that's like at the core of everything we do every day.
Well, and preservation is so multidisciplinary just by its nature. And I think that is why so many people gravitate towards this work, like you're saying, kind of like unofficially or officially. I mean, so I had mentioned I went to the Columbia Program for Preservation, and the gentleman who founded it, James Marston Fitch, and when he started that program in the 60s, there were chemists, there were stay-at-home parents, there were architects, there were writers. Everyone from everywhere is bringing all these unique things to the table and making the conversation and what we are capable of so much more dynamic and richer. It's not simply that we are all historians, that we all know the styles, we know the difference between a tower and a turret. It's not just that, because all of these, we're living in these houses and they're changing over time. So we can all just benefit from this vast, vast knowledge. And I think that it's been so exciting over the last couple of years to see through Cheap Old Houses and through Circa, just all the friendships that we've been able to make, communicating with old house people all across the country who say, like, I don't have a clue what style this house is, but I've been driving by it for years. And I finally had the confidence seeing other people doing it on your feeds, thinking like, I guess I could really do that. I never thought I kind of had permission. I know, Elizabeth, one of the things you've said often about the book is it really is a permission slip for people to think that, like, I can take the leap too. I think I could, I never thought that was an option for me, but it really is. So I think that getting as many people who identify as a preservationist or not is irrelevant. You're all welcome to the party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point. And I know the book makes a powerful case for this, but do you all, Elizabeth, do you want to say a little bit more to people that maybe are afraid? Like, what about all these people who think, what, there's no way I could ever afford an old house, or I could never, I don't have the skills, or I don't have what it takes to be able to do that. Your book is a pretty powerful argument for this, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why that's not true, why everyone is invited to the party, why this is an activity that everyone can engage in, and that it's open, and it's open to anyone who wants to come in.
The best I can do, I'm a mother. And I think anyone who's a parent out there understands that you when you had that baby, you had no idea what you were getting into, and you figured it out. And I think there's no perfect time to do that. I make this analogy all the time, and because I think that it's the kind of thing that will challenge you and will be extremely expensive at times, and will be incredibly rewarding on so many levels. And that if you look back, you would never have any regrets about doing it, even though it was just an immensely challenging thing. And I think there are a lot of things in life that are like that. I think, I've never run a marathon, but I think anybody who has trained for such a thing can understand that, the best things in life aren't just the easiest things. And I love seeing the stories of people. And we have cheapoldhouses.com/saved. We have scores of people. I mean, hundreds, thousands of people have written us, letting us know that they've purchased these homes. They often start Instagram feeds that we can kind of follow along in their restorations. And by and large, it's like the best thing they've ever done in so many cases. It's funny, when we started this, we didn't have a cheap old house of our own. We dreamt of it. We were living just outside New York City. The cost of living was very high. We were in a tiny, adorable little house, but it was, certainly not a forever home. And the cost of doing anything on it would be prohibitive because of the cost of labor where we lived. It was just very, very expensive. And we fell in love with a cheap old farmhouse. And I think it was our own community that kind of inspired us back. Like, well, they can do it, and she can do it, and she doesn't have a super fancy job, and he doesn't have a trust fund, and maybe we can do this. And it's a figuring out as you go kind of process. I am not saying that you should be completely naive, and I definitely don't want to sugarcoat this, because I think that there's different types of houses for everybody. I think you have to understand a little bit about the reality of your life. If you're a person, if you are a person that prefers to go out to a beach all weekend instead of doing house projects, then you're probably going to need to have a lot of money to pay someone to do it. If you are a kind of person that loves to work with your hands and learn things, there are ample tutorials online that you can do that. So I think it's just understanding your lifestyle, a little bit about your budget. You also don't need to do everything right away. I think that it's very easy to walk into a house and think, oh my gosh, there's so much to be done. Now, there are critical things you have to do first. As we all know, as preservationists, water is the biggest enemy. So you have to make sure the house is sealed up. So if the roof has issues, if the foundation has major issues, those are critical things. But redoing your kitchen and so many of the other things that you think need to be done immediately, you can live with for quite a long time. So I think I would say that it's not necessarily just like an overwhelming boulder of black and white. I can, I can't, I don't know. There's so much nuance and gray area in there. And I find so much personal inspiration from watching other people do it and realizing that it's not something that can't be done.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of my jobs, I think, at the National Trust is someone who at least isn't didn't come to this as a professional preservationist, let me say it that way, but is passionate about this work and the work that you're doing, is to try to sort of spread the word, to make it an idea, the idea of preservation, something that more people think about and can see as a part of their lives, and can think about the version of the American dream that you're suggesting, and what would it mean if we all looked with love on these older buildings that we've inherited, that hold so much of our history, and that can reconnect us to that past, and in some sense to one another. Like, what would the world look like if we weren't so invested in everything being shiny and new and almost like cookie cutter? Like, how would our world be different? How would we be different as a community? And there's a part of me that thinks that the more we can spread that mindset, that kind of preservation mindset, the more open we will be to the kind of community building that you all are talking about. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing. It's a pretty powerful thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we don't, I'll just say this flat out. And we don't do a lot of talking with, we do plenty of collaborating with preservation organizations, but when we look to marketing and the way we communicate, it doesn't interest me if we're looking at how a successful preservation group is marketing. I'm interested in what a successful brand of any type is doing out there and how they're getting their word across. And so we look across many different disciplines, and our inspiration, comes from all different types of marketing and communication out there. And I think not coming from a sort of academic preservation background has huge perks, because you're coming to this with a fresh perspective, and that's incredible. And I think Ethan, my other half on this, other third, I guess, Cristiana, he comes from a digital marketing background, and he thought, how can we take this passion and speak to people in a way of how we're communicating now? So I think him not coming from a preservation background, of course, he loves old houses so much, and we're both old souls, and we have the passion together. But I think it's exactly because of that we've been so successful in getting the word out there, because he wasn't used to the conversation that I had so many times. And I love that I come to the table with the understanding of what people with a preservation background have been taught and the way that it's approached. And it's so important. But I also love having an outside perspective. And I think it's that combination that makes it really powerful.
Yeah, well, and you all have done a great job of opening up the ideas that you're talking about, the idea of what a cheap old house can bring, why it's worth considering, taking that option, how it's a path to home ownership in a really tight market, how you can sort of find your creativity and look for more flexible ways of financing. All of that seems really powerful. And maybe Cristiana, you could talk a little bit more about your approach to making sure that you're really getting that word out to everybody, and the tools that you use, which, as Elizabeth was saying, have been so important.
Sure, sure. Well, and one of the things that comes to mind is, so, cheap old houses, it's right there in the name. The feed is focused on houses that are 150 or sometimes, 100,000, 50,000, 25,000 and lower. Whereas Circa, the counterpart, the kind of other half of cheap old houses, it has everything. Sometimes some cheap houses land there, the multi-million-dollar great grand estates, that are steeped in history land there. We get everything. And one of the things that I always find interesting is when there'll be a wonderful, this tends to happen a lot, for example, in New England, I would say, maybe more than geographically elsewhere. There'll be an amazing house, truly amazing, from, early American, 1690, something like that. And so many people will just reflexively say, this should be a museum. No one should live here. No one should be allowed to touch it. And having worked in a nonprofit, my first reaction is, okay, great. So I'm going to let you take on the fundraising for that, because that's a big to do. Like, that is a huge thing. But I think it's also, I hope that by seeing everybody take on these houses, people are recognizing that, like, we, the populace, have just as much a responsibility than an individual professional organization to keep these houses standing. Why should a nonprofit have to come together to make this one church in the middle of nowhere? Like, why should that have to happen for this church not to crumble to the ground? Like, as long as it's contributing to its community in a meaningful way, we all win. So I think that, when we see those kinds of comments happening, I mean, it's never about saying, no, you're wrong, but it's, just trying to, like, get people to, like, think a little wider every single time, so that maybe after the 10th house that they're seeing on Circa, these 4 years down the line, whenever it may be, they're starting to think that, all these old houses, this messaging isn't exclusionary. It's not professional only. It's for all of us. We all get this. It belongs to us all. So I think that that's something that I am never surprised when those comments come up, but I'm always excited to see when they kind of, like, evolve past that over time. So, on our Instagram, we're doing that through our e-newsletters. Hundreds of thousands of people are subscribing because they have that passion that Elizabeth was talking about, that they want to get in on this kind of old house excitement. So that's exciting to see.
Yeah, I think that's really important. This sense of responsibility that you have, like, why these places, first of all, they should be used, right? They're places that need to be activated and used, and it is our collective responsibility to take care of what we've inherited and to use what we have, not just throw it away. And I think this is a really powerful message. Are there things that could happen? What would make this easier for people to do? In other words, if we want to make it easier for people to think about a cheap old house, making that, your first home, and slowing down, and what would make that, what could we as a community, as a society, what could we do to make that easier for people so that more people could take advantage of this opportunity?
I think what I find, and I worked for so long in New York City, an urban environment, and then I moved to a rural community, and the preservation issues are so incredibly different here. And what it comes down to, and I think this is across the board, it comes down to money. It comes down to what people think nobody wants to buy something that they feel like they're gonna be in a financial pit with. And even the most well-meaning preservationists may not be able to make all the purest, most perfect decisions on their house. So I think I don't think there's any shame in that. I think we should be teaching people what maybe the next best thing is that you can do. Okay, so maybe you can't afford the slate roof. And I mean, sure, if there were grants out there, if there were options to get it, that would be phenomenal. Educating people about the tax incentives is a huge thing, but that can't cover everything. But I think teaching people about, well, what can you do in the meantime? Well, maybe you save up for that. And what are you, rather than teaching people that either, and I'm not saying anybody here is doing this, but I hear a lot of talk in the world of preservation that it's either perfect or it's nothing at all. And I see so many people with so much pride in their house that are well-meaning and want to do the best thing, driven away from making decisions because they don't feel like they're going to be able to do it perfectly. And I think little by little, bit by bit, if in the 30 years of you owning a house, you chip away a little bit at getting it a little bit back, that's good enough. And maybe celebrating those smaller wins and educating people about the second best solution. That's not going to hurt the house, but is going to be able to carry them over in a way that is going to work with their own budget would be really helpful.
I would say when going from having been an advocate in the city, living in an apartment, not owning, to now owning my house, oh my gosh, it's such night and day. I mean, we would be at the Landmarks Commission testifying on, a stoop renovation or restoration or something. And I just remember with my advocate brain on, my professional preservationist brain, it was barely ever good enough. It was so close, but you need to do these 10,000 more things to make it perfect, perfect, perfect. And now I just think, oh my gosh, if little Cristiana Peña was at the Landmarks Commission as a homeowner now, I would be terrified. I would think that preservationists were out to get me because I didn't have enough money. I wasn't doing it right. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just trying to love my house in like the incremental way I can. So yeah, I think that under it, and again, I get it's different. Like sometimes in those instances, it was, a multi-million-dollar something. So like, okay, what's $5,000 more to do it correct? That's a different story than me and my tiny budget. But like the bigger lesson there, I think, is that preservationists can be mindful, exactly what you're saying, Elizabeth, like people are trying their best and it looks different for everyone based on their means and their timeline and all the other factors. So just like cheering each other on and sharing, like not secrets, sharing tips, like sharing who's your great contractor. Oh, what bank did you go to that you got that loan? I've been having trouble. Oh, what is like just being as transparent as possible about resources and information sharing is so incredibly powerful. I mean, the number of times I've texted Elizabeth and Ethan saying, who's your foundation guy? Do you have a plumber? Like, I need someone. Who do you have that's going to know that this is an old house that needs special care? It's so valuable.
Yeah, there was one guy in my town that everybody used.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we do have that we share that information, and that's a role the National Trust can play. Sharing information. We have a new retrofit campaign that's aimed at historic homeowners to try to help them with renovations, and particularly with energy efficiency, to address some of the challenges, Elizabeth, that you were pointing to. And I think it is important to remember that the alternative to pretty good preservation isn't always perfect preservation. It's demolition or demolition by neglect. So I think there's power in figuring out how we can all have the flexibility that we need to celebrate small wins, honor the efforts that people are putting in, and identify, what as an individual, what you really want to protect, and what, you can do the second or the third best thing in the interest of either energy efficiency or cost or whatever, or just, livability. So I think that's also a really important message.
A lot of people around us, I think when we think of people buying old houses, I think of, people just now looking at a real estate listing, trying to buy a big old house that they want to restore. That's a group. That's certainly a group, and that's a group we work with all the time. But there are a lot of people around us in this rural community who are living in old houses because that's all that's there. Or they inherited their grandmother's house, or that's what the housing stock is around where I live. And it wasn't necessarily that they went in with a huge preservation mindset, and this has been my dream forever. And there's that community too. And how do we talk to them about the best thing to do for that house? So I think to sort of bucket types of preservation, to say that there's one type of preservationist, or old house owner, it's short-sighted. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different conversations that have to happen.
Yeah, and a lot of different kind of resources to provide. Yeah, I think I've certainly learned that in my time at the trust. Excuse me, just how many that people come to preservation for so many different reasons, and they have different outcomes. They have different aims. They're in it for different reasons. So I think it's important to honor that. I know that we want to make sure that our participants on the webinar have time to ask you both all questions. So why don't we get started with that? And Priya, do you want to field those questions for us?
Yeah, I will go ahead and read them out. There's a lot of really good ones, so I'm sorry we probably won't get to all of them, but I did my best to pick ones that fit many categories. So the first one's from Lynn. I'm always curious about what kind of things or approaches people would do / make differently after finishing a massive project like this. If you're taking lessons learned from each job and applying them to the next and realizing that every situation is different, what's one consistent thought you have that resonates and you make sure to consider going forward? So what is like the biggest lesson learned?
I don't know if this is the answer she's looking for. It's a
Yeah.
it's a great question. I mean, one of the things is going easy on yourself and realizing that sometimes you just have to make a decision. And a lot of things in these houses are reversible. It's okay. I think sometimes you have to move forward, and you have to keep the project moving along, and you can research and research and research and research and do everything you can. And there are occasions when things just don't go according to plan, and that's every old house. And I think forgiving yourself and realizing that this house has been here for 300 years, despite all the mistakes that people have made on it, like, you're going to be okay. I think it's just sort of de-stressing as the process goes along. It can be very intimidating, all the decisions you have to make.
I would just add to that, the one other thing that comes to mind on just like a very practical level is just how important a good team is around you. That once you've, it might be a completely different scope, needs, every project is a little different, but once you find someone who gets historic carpentry, who gets roofs, who gets whatever the thing is, like the value, it's just beyond value. I mean, it's so important to just, invest in each other, invest in craftspeople locally to you. I think that's one just very kind of practical thing that I would say as well.
Yeah, when we were
I would say-
interviewing, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Carol.
I was just going to add, like, one of the things that you both mentioned is slowing down. You're giving yourself time to just slow down and not expect, that it's all going to happen at once. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I interrupted.
I promised my partner it wouldn't take us 20 years to do the church. We're only 3 years in, so I've got a runway. I've got a runway left.
Elizabeth, did you have something you were going to add?
It's all good.
Okay. Laura, I'm just going to pick her first question is, how much do you stress the environmental element as well as the probably more walkable neighborhood when you encourage people to think about buying these houses?
I think, I kind of leave it up to the buyer. I think we find it's our job to put the houses out there and let them know the potential. And there are people who want walkable neighborhoods, and that will definitely be a factor in it. I'm certainly not telling people to buy this house if it's in the kind of neighborhood they're not interested in being in. And so, I mean, I am all for walkable neighborhoods. I absolutely am a huge advocate for them. I love them. And in terms of the environment, I think inherently what we do is so environmental by reusing what we have. And not only that, but the idea of fixing something requires a certain type of craftsmanship, which is encouraging those kind of trades to survive. When you buy antique furniture versus something that comes in a giant styrofoam box, that's the environment, that's reusing something. I think there's a lot of work to be done about new technologies in sort of the green building world being incorporated into old houses. And I know that's something the trust is working heavily on, which is really exciting to us to find out. But I think inherently there is so much that is already built into the world of preservation that I think we're so proud to kind of just be a part of.
Great. Trying to decide between two. Okay, we're going to do this one first. Anne asked, I'm in an area that is developing really fast where old homes and barns are being bulldozed. Do you have an idea about how to change the community outlook to get people energized around this idea around reusing old houses?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is showing by doing as much as possible, right? You can tell people that there's, you should keep that barn because, you should keep this thing because, but to the extent that it may be feasible to point to other places where it was done successfully within whatever means feels kind of comparable to your area could be one strategy to think about. I mean, when I was trying to convince my partner that we should take on a church, I said, we're not the first. There are other people who've done this, so it helps kind of see like the finish line. So that may well be part of it, building community by showing people that like what you're trying to get them to understand has been achieved elsewhere. I would try that.
Okay, Edward's asking, you haven't really touched on historic tax credits, and I know we talked about that a little bit in the pre-planning period. But he's saying that cheap old houses are often in underserved neighborhoods that after achieving a certain amount of these rehabilitations and these adaptive reuses, the neighborhood becomes too pricey for a lot of people. And so if you can talk a little bit more about the value of the tax credit and also how what you are doing is really, really emphasizing the need of being in a community and of the community so that displacement doesn't happen. So if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think there is an issue of displacement. There's also a lot of the, in communities around me, there's literally abandonment of these homes. I think in more places than others, displacement is certainly a huge issue. That was a huge issue when we were working in New York City. I mean, there's undeniably so. Um, uh, in terms of the tax credits, I was very surprised when we bought our house, which is in a National Register Historic District, and we found out that the roof needed a complete replacement, that neither our real estate agent or the real estate agent selling us the house said, oh, but by the way, did you know it's in a National Register Historic District and you can get 20% back? Because I have an academic background in preservation, I did that research and I found out, but I was very surprised that that wasn't common knowledge. And the tax credit has been huge for us, and just even fixing our gutters, doing small upgrades to the house. It's a one-pager you fill out once it's on the National Register, and it's incredibly easy to use. Um, I think displacement happens with both preservation, with both, anytime a neighborhood becomes more expensive, which is an issue that is happening across the country in every community, whether it's an old house neighborhood or not. And it's happening with new development as much as it is with people restoring old houses. And I will not get off my train of preservation, because I feel like anytime a community is improved, that's an inevitable thing that happens. But I think it happens in cases outside of preservation just as strongly.
I mean, I think it's an interesting, this is an interesting question to think about too. Um, as is the previous question, which is really about how do you get people interested in preservation as an option for a community, at the community level. Why should a particular community care about preservation? And be willing as a community to act to save some of the vacant older buildings in the neighborhood. And I do think it's helpful sometimes to point to the power of repurposing and adaptive reuse, and to be able to point out some of the ways in which that's been an effective driver of community building and even economic opportunity in certain areas, so that people can see that preservation and economic opportunity are not opposed to one another. You can actually use preservation practice and preservation tools as a way of generating community involvement, generating jobs, generating economic activity. And I think we at the Trust try to point to those projects specifically to be able to say, if your community has, a vacant downtown, here's a way that you can bring people back to that downtown. If you need more housing, here's a way to repurpose these beautiful older structures for housing. We have examples of that, so that demolition isn't the first thing that people think of, oh, we need more of this, we need to build it from scratch. And I think that's something that I've really learned from Elizabeth and Cristiana, is it's really important to stress that these things are not opposed to one another, that they actually work together, and the solutions are better when they're working together.
I want to just give a shout out to my friend Daniel Cantor, who works at the Kingston City Land Bank in Kingston, New York, where they have a program where they buy, the land bank gets a hold of foreclosed homes, and they restore them, and then they put them out on a system only to people that are only available to people living on that block. So it's keeping people in the communities that are already in the communities, and allowing them a lottery system to be able to get into that house as a first step toward home ownership. And I think that's a great example of a way to use preservation, not displace the community that's already there, and to keep the existing housing stock. So I think it's getting creative with how we use it, but I just don't think that preservation itself is always the enemy here. So I just want to kind of make that distinction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Preservation is definitely not, preservation is an ally. Right? We have to think of preservation as the ally, and often it is positioned as the enemy. And I think we're right to resist that positioning.
Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more. So Sarah Lynn asked, and I think you've touched on this a little bit in the bigger conversation, but I thought it was worth asking again, especially since we had a lot of questions around financing. When all obvious financing alternatives for restoration have been exhausted and DIY will not be enough, how do you, what are the ideas for alternative funding, or where would you suggest people look for alternatives?
I mean, Elizabeth, one thing that comes to mind, and this is maybe a very particular case, but I think it's very inspiring in terms of the creativity that it hopefully could trigger in others, is featured in the book is Duncan Manor, and how Randy and Dave have created. I'll leave it to you. You literally wrote the book. You know it. You know it cover to cover, their story. But I think that they're a great example to get people inspired. If you don't mind sharing that one.
Randy and Dave purchased a house off of Circa for $149,000, a giant Italianate mansion in the middle of a field. It's completely otherworldly. It's been in movies. It's literally a movie set. And it had been on Illinois' most endangered list for a long time before they purchased it. Many people had tried before them. I mean, it was the definition of what you'd think of as a money pit with a giant old house. And they come at this with no special financial means, and they have turned it into a nonprofit. So they're funneling money into it by hosting events there, and all the money feeds back into the restoration. And they've just gotten incredibly creative with financing it in interesting ways, using it as sort of a public-private space. And they've been very successful, and they just celebrated their 10-year anniversary. So at Duncan Manor, if you want to follow them, I think they're really inspiring.
And I realize not everyone wants their house to be a literal movie set the way Duncan Manor is, but a lot of other old house people do this as well. You know, you're asking for creative ways to like help with funding. So get creative. I mean, there are different places where if you're open to it, you can make your home available for filming commercials, TV, movies. And that can be, I mean, we have a mutual friend in Massachusetts. Her home was scouted and used for, I think, an AMC show. And as part of that process, they completely restored this beautiful Italianate staircase to her specifications. And then I think the show didn't even get greenlit. So I don't know if it's ever going to air, but she has this insane restoration. It's the exception, not the rule. But it just shows that when you're open to these creative things, when you like put those on the table for yourself, some really great things can happen.
So the last question I'm going to use as sort of a way for you guys to plug your Instagrams and your digital presence. The question was from Patricia is how can we preserve and restore more cheap old houses in more rural towns and suburban neighborhoods, also on main streets where former stores and schools or sanctuaries are now live. And I wanted you guys to take a moment to talk about this incredible digital community that you've put together that we haven't really touched on through this entire conversation. So I feel like that's a nice place for us to end on. And for everyone here, I've been sharing links in the chat. We will also include those links in the follow-up email that will also include the recording of this session. And it's the email you use to register for this session. But I will let you guys go.
You want to go first, Cristiana?
Sure, I guess. I mean, I think how can you preserve and restore more cheap old houses in rural towns? I mean, part of it, I thank you, Priya, from the community aspect of it, is just like making more and more and more people aware that it's an option, it's viable, it's doable. I mean, my partner and I were able to move from Brooklyn in New York City to literally the middle of nowhere because we work remotely, but we were excited to have that balance of, like not being in such an urban environment for us at that time. I mean, it's a personal choice, of course, but I think that the more people that recognize that it can be done with how creative our work lives are now, just letting the community get bigger and bigger and sharing the message so that more people want to be a part of it. I mean, because how do you preserve those towns? You get more people to want to be there. You get more people to see that as an appealing way of life. You get more people to see that I can still have community. I can, feed another part of my personality and soul that maybe I wasn't getting in a more urban space. I think it's just like being the evangelist for this movement as much as we can and as loudly as we can. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's sort of walking the walk, that support your local restaurants, spend money at them. I think really put your money where your mouth is. I mean, we bought a house in a rural community and we're living the small town life and figuring it out. And I completely agree with Cristiana on that. It's something that's very near and dear to our hearts.
Yeah. So like Priya said, I mean, follow at Circa Houses, follow at Cheap Old Houses. And in addition to sharing properties that are actively on the market that hopefully people will, scoop up and save and share with us along the way, we do share success stories and people who have saved an old house and are, chipping away at it bit by bit. And I think that there's a lot of inspiration to be found there. So follow.
I'm so grateful to both of you for taking the time to be with us. And I know everyone listening and watching has really been inspired by the work that you've done and by this kind of call to action, right? This is our built environment. We have a responsibility for it, and we should use what we've inherited, and treat it with respect. So I really appreciate the conversation. So thank you so much for joining.
Great. And we have, before we close out, we do have a couple of closing slides. So Rhonda, if you don't mind throwing the slides back up real quick. And so basically, we really appreciate you all joining us today. If you don't know, the National Trust hosts a number of different webinars over the course of the year. Our next one is going to be looking at Asheville and Altadena and the impact of shifting your perspective related to preservation after natural disasters. We have a couple of others in the works that we're hoping to share shortly, probably by Friday, actually. So keep an eye out on our upcoming webinars page, which is linked here. And then finally, as I mentioned, this is our 75th year. And so we wanted to make the ask that you would consider contributing to the work of the National Trust. There are two ways you can do this, by going to savingplaces.org/support, or if you have a donor advised fund, we have a link there as well. And we will share all of this information and links in the follow-up email. Thank you again, Elizabeth, Cristiana, Carol, and my colleagues, Rhonda and Colleen, who are behind the scenes, for sharing their knowledge, and for all of you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at forum@savingplaces or info@savingplaces.org. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for coming today, and have a great week. Thank you.